Le poststructuralisme français a connu un grand succès sur les campus universitaires américains à partir des années 1970. Ses idées et ses méthodes ont été importées et mobilisées à des fins d'innovation intellectuelle apparente et surtout d'activisme politique. Dans les sciences sociales et surtout les humanités, des générations d'étudiants auront été encouragés à divers degrés et parfois de manière exclusive à lire le monde à travers la grille des luttes d'influence entre groupes démographiques, une grille d'inspiration marxiste remise au goût du jour par Foucault et surtout par ses disciples dans les départements de littérature et de sociologie. Mon invité dans cet épisode, Helen Pluckrose, a étudié à l'université dans un contexte de prééminence postmoderne. French Poststructuralism has enjoyed much success on American university campuses from the 1970s onwards. Its ideas and methods were imported and mobilized both for apparent intellectual innovation and especially for political activism. In the social sciences and especially in the humanities, generations of students have been encouraged, sometimes exclusively, to see the world through the lens of power struggles between groups, a lens inspired from Marx and refreshed by Foucault and especially his disciples in literature and sociology departments. My guest for this episode, Helen Pluckrose, studied at university in a climate of postmodern predominance. So I'm thrilled to be here today with Helen Pluckrose. Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Sure. So you're now an assistant editor at Areo Magazine, and you frequently write short essays for this magazine, as well as for Canada's News.
That's right, yes.
You obtained a degree in English literature from the University of East London, and later a master's in early modern studies from Queen Mary University London. And you have done academic work on late medieval and early modern religious writing by and for women.
Yes, that's been my academic interest.
Okay. Are you still in academia, by the way? Because I couldn't find information on that.
No, I took a year out to work up a PhD proposal, and then things just kept happening in the political world right now, and I kept writing about them, and I'm not sure I will go back.
Okay.
I've just signed a book deal to write a book about postmodernism and critical theory, so I have a feeling that's going to be occupying the next year at least.
Okay, well, very nice. But that's going to be one of the main themes of our conversation. Maybe we can start by talking about your time at university, if it's okay with you, because I have read that you were exposed to a lot of content based on postmodernism and critical theory, which you just mentioned. So you studied, if I'm not wrong, literature and history?
Yes.
Yes. So given that you did study these in these fields, some people, including myself, will not be massively surprised to hear that you were indeed exposed to a lot of content of a postmodern or critical theoretical nature. But I just wonder what it's like, in practice.
Well, when I started university, when I went back again, I was a mature student, but the emphasis was very much on, as soon as you started the English literature degree, it was that liberal humanism was a naive, racist, colonialist, masculinist ideal, which was now outdated, and that postmodernism had come in, and successive waves of critical theory, which give us different lenses by which to look at texts. And this is the way we are to go now. So as somebody coming in who hadn't really evaluated this sort of thing before, I was coming very much from a skeptical point of view. I was already writing a bit as one of those awful new atheists, but I was very much pro-science, although I'm not interested in science as much as I am in the humanities myself. And so I was trying to make sense of this, which led me to doing an awful lot of reading about postmodernism, about the epistemology of it and where it all came from. And that was when I became quite concerned about how far-reaching it is now that it's sort of left the universities. It's it's sort of become much more into the mainstream leftist social conscience now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a huge thing.
Yeah. So I really wonder because, say, I don't know how studies, especially in these fields, because I studied physics and studied not in the UK myself, but so I don't know how studies work in the UK in the humanities. But say if you had in a given semester 5 different classes, I wonder, in how many of these 5 classes you would have been, um, told, I guess from day one or close enough that, well, it's essentially what you explained, that there is this new game in town, postmodernism. I wonder, to what extent it was, popular in these classes.
Well, in the English literature degree, which I just focused on English literature, it was a requirement of every single essay that some form of literary theory was used. You had the choice of feminism, post-colonialism, queer theory, Marxism, deconstruction, various different things, but one of those had to be used. It wasn't acceptable to take what they call a liberal humanist approach and look at the text straightforwardly and pick out themes from it. And there had to be some kind of ideological analysis, and the postmodernism module was a compulsory one. And when I wrote my essay about it, I felt, for the sake of my own integrity, that I had to have a long introduction in which I explained why everything else I'm going to say is complete nonsense. And it was very hard to think outside this for a long time. I thought, am I getting it wrong? Is there something I'm missing here? But this just seems crazy. So, but at postgraduate, they have a much more, that they have an emphasis on having gone past postmodernism, that it's no longer a real thing. It's dead. We've moved on. We're back to empirical data now. But in fact, what we find is that the ideas of postmodernism, and we have to be very clear on what we're talking about when we talk about postmodernism, because it's such a massive field. The critics of postmodernism are really talking about some very specific things. They're talking about an attitude to knowledge, whether objective knowledge can be obtained and how it can be obtained. We're talking about the power of language. Is reality constructed by language? This was Foucault's idea, that reality is a matter of competing discourses, and the most dominant ones win out. They construct the reality, and then we're down to identity, and the idea that we are positioned by our identity as women, as people of colour, as homosexuals, or whatever, in a subordinate position, or if we're straight white men, then we're in the top position, and we get to set the narrative for everyone. So it's these ideas of knowledge being positional, of it being subjective, of there not really being an objective knowledge which anyone can access, and this idea of the power of speech, and the idea of the individual as part of a social class rather than as an individual or as a human, with a sort of shared humanity going on, which was the mainstream. That was the universal liberal idea, that everyone was a human and that everyone should have access to the whole world of human ideas and human opportunities. But then when the postmodernists came in and complicated this, they pointed out quite rightly that some people are disadvantaged and they don't have the same access as others do because of inequalities in society. So then when the intersectionals and like Kimberly Crenshaw, she came in and she took a good look at these sort of imbalances, but we've just got quite lost on the way, where she said quite rightly that we need to have some focus on identities and clusters of power around identities and a lack of power for other identities.
Yeah.
In response, this has tended to sort of push out the notion of individuality and the notion of universality. sorry, that was a very long answer, but yeah,
Mhm.
it really is this quite sort of drastic shift from a universal liberalism to this world which is really quite counterintuitive, that people have find quite difficult to grasp, of power structures and of language constructing reality, and of knowledge being positional, and that you can get at different bits of it depending from where you are. It really is a very, very strange worldview, and it is now, I'm afraid, it is dominating the universities, and even at a much sort of lower level. I mean, it was Jonathan Gottschall who said that the theory is not dead. People will say that postmodernism has gone, but in reality they have internalized so much of it. When I went to do the postgraduate study, I was so delighted. My tutor, he said to me, postmodernism, it's silly, we're not going to be doing it. As soon as I tried to write an essay using evolutionary psychology, I was penalised severely because I'd said that sexual selection was real. That indicated that women were going to continue to be found attractive because of beauty and youth. And I'd also said that racism can be overcome by shared goals, which is something which comes up in studies a lot. As soon as you put people of different races in the same team, following the same goals, racial categorizations are no longer made in the brain. That they got rid of very quickly. Whereas gender categorizations remain. We're always aware if one of the group is a woman while the rest are men, for example. But we forget very quickly if one of the group is black while the rest are white. And this is probably hardwired because we haven't been in separate groups in conflict with each other for long enough for racism to have been embedded. But we have, for millions and millions of years, needed to be aware of who is male and who is female. So I tried to argue this, but apparently I wasn't allowed to say that because it could offend black communities in America. And this is the kind of sort of internalized sort of ideas of these structures of power, of reality needing to measure up with discourse, which I've been trying to talk about.
Okay, so we can talk a bit more about this, what you just mentioned, because you've hinted at, postmodernism being supposedly not in use by, well, in this case, it was in your, higher level of studies. You've also written about the so-called death of postmodernism, and I had been thinking already for a while that, although postmodernism in the stricter sense of the term, which could be said to include Derrida and deconstruction, Foucault and historicism, and also maybe some other thinkers such as Deleuze and Baudrillard and their musings of strange character that they called philosophical, but that can be debated. So this has very probably receded to some extent. But I've been thinking that even though this is the case, and this is also something something which you've noticed, even though this is the case that they have their direct influences receded, it doesn't mean that postmodernism had lost its influence on our culture, because these ideas have been adopted and mobilized by especially American scholar activists.
Yes.
And so today I read your article, Postmodernism is Not Dead, that makes exactly this case, and very much in the same terms that I would have. Maybe you can flesh out your view of, the different phases of postmodernism.
Yeah, the sort of progression through successive waves of critical theory, and then into activism, and then into sort of mainstream culture is something which is quite difficult for people to trace. If sometimes, that people imagine, well, Foucault said this and it somehow just went into the brains of people who've never read Foucault. No, this isn't obviously how it worked. But we had that high deconstructive phase where some very different thinkers, but with quite a lot of in common. All these ideas came together from people like Foucault, Lyotard, Baudrillard, Derrida, Lacan. So all your countrymen, I'm noticing.
Indeed.
These ideas, they became powerful, but only within the university. They weren't really very user-friendly. They weren't of interest to people outside the universities to any great extent, because there was nothing really that anyone could do with them. They broke everything down. There was little political aim. There was political motivation for breaking down structures of modernity, but there wasn't really any political aim. But then the first critical theorists after this high deconstructive phase had sort of burnt itself out were the post-colonialists.
Okay.
And they're almost contemporaneous with the postmodernists, and they're often even taught together, because Edward Said was a Foucauldian. He is responsible for taking Foucault's ideas to the States, although he later disagreed with Foucault quite strongly. His influence in his work is ever present, and it is this idea of Orientalism of Edward Said, which is Foucauldian, which formed the basis of post-colonial theory. When Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak took up the mantle of post-colonialism, they went back to an even more post-structuralist approach via Derrida. And they are very, very difficult to understand because they are constantly sort of looking for the aporia. They are breaking things down. But there's now a political element. This isn't just, look, here's some structure which seems coherent, let's see how we can take it apart. There was an aim now. There's a political aim. White Western imperialism has dominated, and now it is time to take those stories apart and let the East have its own voice and tell its own stories. And to a large extent, that is a very positive development. But the epistemology of this, the approach to it, the postmodern approach is really quite destructive. It's quite counterproductive. It doesn't focus on what was misrepresented that can now be corrected. I mean, Edward Said said specifically, we can change the stories, we can tell the story. And what he was talking about was this quite Derridean idea and Foucauldian idea that you can narrate the story differently to your own liking, and now we have a different truth. So this is, post-colonialism has got a strange sort of mix of recuperation, but also of invention to it. But then, most interestingly, when we had coming next intersectionality and critical race theory, both which owe an awful lot to Kimberly Crenshaw, she is the one who articulated the evolution, the shift that was going to happen within postmodernism. I mean, she said that she sees intersectionality as postmodernism applied to politics. So she saw that very strongly, that she was continuing that goal. But she said that while the postmodernists get things right with their cultural constructivism of gender, of race, of categories, they didn't leave room for political activism, because they also deconstructed structures and systems. So she wanted to look at systems of power politically so that they could be dismantled. And this is the problem with postmodernism. If you are tearing everything down and saying that nothing is objectively real and everything is a perspective, then you can't really address any problems. So she's ended up keeping the cultural constructivism of gender and race, but coming back to a reality of oppression and systems of power and privilege. And that is the big shift that took place, because it seems on one level that this is a return to empiricism. We can now say that a reality exists and it's an oppressive reality. But on another, that's quite misleading, because this recognition of these oppressive systems is coming from lived experience, from perspectives. It's another part of this sort of positioning thing where we are not really looking for an objective truth, such as, are women paid as much as men? Let's look at the data here. If they're not, find out the cause, address the cause. We're now saying, well, my perspective is that I am being oppressed by this language or this attitude, and there isn't anything that can be done to address this, to respond to this, because the perspective and the experience of the marginalized person now is a form of knowledge. So, and with this is course coming from standpoint theory, which is a very strong part of intersectionality. So it's getting steadily messier, where we're now claiming that that a reality exists. It's a reality of structures of power and prejudice, but a reality, but gender and race and everything are still culturally constructed. Knowledge is still situated. It's still constructed in discourses, which can be interpreted by anyone, but actually have most impact when they're being interpreted by the people who are claiming to be marginalised by them. So it's really quite difficult to sort of explain it. We need a big sort of diagram, really, of how all these things connect to each other. But we're ending up with a situation in which oppression can be claimed to have been experienced, and there is no way to look at it objectively, to measure it, to actually do anything about it. And that was coming largely from intersectionality and critical race theory, although Kimberly Crenshaw herself was very, very rigorous in her original investigations. And she feels now that quite a lot of the intersectionality has got away from her. But this is what it tends to do. It tends to build on itself, feed on itself, and get more and more abstract and diffuse and really, really quite subjective and experiential. So it's just very difficult to counter or even to understand. You just have to accept.
Okay. Yeah, I was not aware that she had pronounced on recent evolutions of intersectionality theory, Kimberly Crenshaw.
Yes, I think there's a YouTube video of her talking about it, saying that intersectionality is some people she feels are now doing it wrong. But when you go back to what she argued for in the first place, it was for cultural constructivism. It was for these systems and positionality. It was for identity politics over universal human rights and liberalism. So it's really hard to see how it could have gone any other way, apart from the divisiveness and the sort of confusion that we have now.
Okay, so that is for the link between maybe what one could call French post-structuralism at the origin, and on the contemporary scene, the activist scholarship of Anglosphere academia.
Yeah, so of course queer theory was the latest element of that, and that Judith Butler is very strongly interested, but influenced by Foucault and Derrida, and so that as well has got the strongest elements of the cultural construction of sexuality, of gender, and even of biological sex, which is very, very difficult to understand, and Judith Butler certainly is. And then on top of this, we have little sort of branches of things such as fat theory, and the construction of ableness, the critical ableness theory, where we're looking at why we have come to believe that it's better to be able-bodied than disabled. And I mean, this has some very good elements within it, because ableism really is a problem, where people will assume that somebody who is perhaps has to be a wheelchair user then isn't a full person who can be an asset in a workplace. But that isn't what this is doing. The whole critical. There's a wonderful book, The Construction of Abledness, which really does look at why we came to believe that it's better to be able to walk than not to walk, to hear than not to hear, etc. And this is having some quite nasty effects, where if somebody suggests that a baby's hearing or sight should be restored if it can be, then they are accused of saying that that people who cannot see or hear are worthless, that they're denying their humanity. If we say that it is better to be healthy than unhealthy, then we want unhealthy people not to exist. Well, yes, we do, but that doesn't mean we want to genocide them. They're still worthy people, who have full human rights. We'd just like them to be healthy, worthy people. And this is, I've got into a couple of arguments with the accusers of ableism, which have just been really quite mind-bending, and it's it's quite difficult to explain where they're coming from, and you really have to see this progression of ideas of cultural constructivism. And that's why I'm going to write this book, because I can't do this justice in an essay. I'm going to need about 80,000 words to show how these ideas have developed and branched out. But what we get from this, I mean, these theories, these are sort of the next wave of critical theory is much more user friendly. I mean, some of it is still very obscurantist, particularly within post-colonialism and queer theory. The language can be very difficult to pass, but a lot of the ideas, particularly within intersectionality and critical race theory, they are simple, they are directly applicable. They can be reduced into things like microaggressions and things that people can spot, and things that people can oppose: white privilege, white fragility, epistemic injustice. All of these sort of ideas that are coming out of this are quite are user friendly, and they can be distilled into sort of mantras for activists who are then feeling that they have a purpose, that it's supported by the scholarship, and they are arguing. I mean, how often do we hear we need to decolonize anything from science to hairstyles? Now, and this is a sort of bastardization, a simplification of post-colonial theory, where you can read these layers of power into almost anything. And you can sort of, that if everything is culturally constructed, then this looking at culture with a fine tooth comb, if we're looking, we see that a white person has dreadlocks, then we're seeing a problem in which a culture which has been marginalized and colonized and oppressed by this white person's ancestors is now being appropriated by it, which is an insult on top of this. So this is something that activists can do. They can go out, they can police this, they can police language, they can police the wrong use of pronouns, saying things like both genders or pregnant women, which are, if you truly believe this idea that reality is constructed by discourse, then you can't have a reality in which people say both genders and pregnant women and hope that trans people will ever be accepted. So this sort of drive to perfect language, to get rid of microaggressions, to get rid of cultural appropriation, it all stems back to this understanding of social reality as constructed in language and as performed by sort of dominant, seen as privileged people in society. So you can trace quite a direct line back from what we're seeing in activism to the original thought of the French theorists. And it sounds oversimplistic. People will say, but surely, these people, they're not reading Foucault, they're not reading Derrida, and no, they're not. But these ideas, they get into culture, they become part of the air. I mean, we see, for example, in, say, Pakistan, when you've got a whole load of people with really strong ideas about religion, about what is acceptable and what isn't. You can see a whole crowd will rise up in fury when it's been heard that somebody has torn a page out of the Quran or something like this. Now, these people will have very firm ideas about is and isn't acceptable, but they won't necessarily have gone to university to study theology. They read the Quran in Arabic. The ideas have permeated the society. They've started among the intellectuals, and the ideas from theology, the accepted orthodoxies of religion, then go out into society among heads of industry, among religious leaders, and then they spread out further until somebody who may not even be able to read still has this very firm idea of this epistemology, which is dominated by Islamic narratives. And this is something, I mean, I'm not wanting to compare postmodernism and the worst aspects of Islam, obviously, but the idea that ideas cannot seep into society unless everyone is reading French theorists is nonsense. They seep. We see how they do this. And what we have to remember as well is that we have become increasingly liberal, and we're proud of the changes and the moves we've made towards equality in the name of the civil rights movement, gay pride, second wave liberal feminism. And these ideas are claiming to be a continuation of this project.
You mean, when you say these ideas, you mean the current strands of activism?
Current activism, current feminist activism, anti-racist activism, and LGBT activism. You know, there's still some very reasonable forms of activism for all of those, but the postmodern inspired anti-racism, feminism, etc. They do trade on the good name of the civil rights movement, of gay pride, and for the majority of people, we want not to be sexist, we want not to be racist, we want to be accepting of sexual minorities. We regard the universities, the activists as some kind of authority on this, and we try to do what is suggested. And particularly with the big corporations, they don't want to get known as racist, they don't want to get known as sexist. If they are shown not to care about diversion, inclusion, etc., in precisely the right way, this can have devastating consequences for them. So in this way, these ideas are becoming part of big industries, as we saw with the James Damore Google incident. It's quite likely that Google managers aren't radical cultural constructivists, but they are under great pressure to respond to attacks on the orthodoxy of cultural constructivism. Because if James Damore can get away with saying that men and women are not biologically identical in what they're interested in, then this is so far now understood as sexist, as anti-women, as discouraging of women from entering these sort of professions. And this, again, you can only understand how this makes sense if you understand that discourses are understood to create reality. If reality is created by what most people believe and what most people say, James Damore saying, but women aren't interested in this, in coding and programming to the same degree that men are, could actually have an effect on whether women become interested in coding and programming. It's absolutely insane. And so Google has to make an example of this. I mean, the thing that he was actually sacked for was perpetuating stereotypes. You know, it's really very difficult not to blame postmodernism and the evolution of it through successive theories, through activism and into mainstream culture for what is happening right now.
Yeah, I've noticed that some people tend to get angry when you make the connection. Actually, I mean, when I make the connection, to be more precise, when the maybe the starting point of the discussion is social justice activism of the 21st century, and then if I try to say, well, as far as I know, these people have been educated by people who've been educated maybe by the likes of Judith Butler, and Judith Butler was an avid reader of Derrida and Lacan and Foucault. You sort of propagate backwards through time. It seems to me that the intellectual genealogy is pretty clear, but you have people who are not maybe the rank and file of social justice activists themselves, but maybe very sympathetic to the cause, but maybe better read than some of their comrades. They will tend to get often quite angry quite angry if you point out that some of the most ludicrous ideas of the current social justice activists can be traced back, at least to some extent, to the French post-structuralists, for instance.
They get quite annoyed on both sides. There are an awful lot of defenders of the original postmodernists who are outraged that we could suggest that the current soc just lunacy has anything to do with it, because that they'll find you a text where Derrida said he hated identity politics, and but these ideas have evolved, and as you say, that there's the genealogy which we show, and then there will also be the maddest of the soc just activists who will get annoyed if you tell them what they're doing is postmodernism, because they don't know the origins of what they're saying either. They will tell me that I mustn't speak to something because I don't have that experience as a white woman, or they will tell me that language constructs reality, but they won't know necessarily know where it's come from. And this is what I mean, because it's been around for a good 60 years now. So it is becoming part of the air, and people are not necessarily recognizing where it's coming from or how it's working. So I think it's quite important that they do understand it, and it's particularly important that for the majority of us who still hold sort of universal liberal ideas, that we understand this mindset as well, because it just seems so bizarre, it seems so mad, it seems hypocritical and inconsistent, and it's very difficult to address it if you don't understand the premise that it's working on.
Yeah, so we talked at length now about this affiliation. I think we both of us agree that it's very clear between the French post-structuralists through the American activist scholars of the 1980s, all the way down to today, the militant students of America, Canada, the UK, South Africa even. So there is this affiliation from 1950s, 1960s France to 21st century Anglosphere. So personally, I don't know if you've explored this very much, but I would even go a step further, and I will explain to you my reasoning here, and you can tell me whether you've thought about this. But I tend to see contemporary postmodern identity politics as a sort of continuation of German nationalism of the 19th century. So I will clarify, because I'm sure that Derrida, Foucault, and the others, they were, for most of them, enthusiastic readers of Heidegger in particular, also of Hegel, Nietzsche. I could cite other names, Fichte, for instance, I guess. And all these German thinkers, to various extents, they had advocated the rejection of Enlightenment philosophy and science, and also they had rejected liberalism. All of these things were deemed abstract, cold, especially foreign to the German spirit. The German spirit was seen as intuitive, organic, romantic, earthbound, so to say, while the Enlightenment liberalism was seen as cosmopolitan, only suitable to the French and the British. So here, I could make a caveat about Nietzsche, who was certainly not a German nationalist, but his criticism, of Enlightenment philosophy that came from the latter part of his career certainly inspired the French post-structuralists a lot. So I'm really tempted to draw a parallel between the German nationalist rejection of science and liberalism on the one hand, from the 19th century, all the way down to 1939 and Heidegger and his very strong sympathies for National Socialism. And on the other hand, the very similar, I would argue, rejection of the same liberal science from the post-structuralists, especially once post-structuralism had been imported into the English-speaking world, especially the intersectionality theorists. Because now we are told that science is a white male enterprise, liberalism is a white supremacist system, the ideals of meritocracy, objectivity, or oppressive lies. And this is very similar, as far as I would argue, to, when we were told that the same liberal Enlightenment ideals were contrary to the German Blut und Boden, the blood and the soil. I don't know what you make of that.
Yeah, I think Stephen Hicks makes
yes,
a similar...
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and you certainly can consider postmodernism as an extension of Counter-Enlightenment ideas, and philosophically, yes, you'll see a lot of the same anti-science, anti-reason arguments coming up. I have to say that 20th century, 19th century philosophers are not my area of expertise. But I do certainly see the continuity that that people like Hicks and that have pointed out, and which you have just sort of highlighted the main sort of connections of. But what I tend to find more interesting myself is the psychology underlying this. There is a consistency of rejection of science, of evidence, of reason, of this kind of rigorous feeling, a sort of rigorous process. And I think this comes down to the feeling of a need, a sort of a spiritual need almost. There needs to be something mystical that we need not to be able to understand everything. I'm becoming more and more convinced that a lot of this comes down to a difference in personality types.
Yeah.
More than anything. And Jonathan Haidt, obviously, with his moral foundations theory, seems to support this quite well, that we humans, we're not purely rational animals. This whole sort of weird society, Western educated, industrial, democratic, rich, that has been set up, it's new and it's unusual, and it's very, very vulnerable, because the attacks that we think of as Counter-Enlightenment, culminating in postmodernism and the current lunacy we have now, I would put them down much more to some very, very strong traits within humans. I almost think this is our default, to find science and evidence and reason counterintuitive, to resist it and to seek a more sort of potentially noble and spiritual aims. I think all sort of wrapped up in narratives that are emotionally resonant. I mean, and this is how we describe the post-truth phenomenon, isn't it?
Well, it sounds a lot like religion as well.
Yes, religion, that the postmodernism. It all speaks to a human psychology, a need for something more than reason and evidence and a rational look on life. There is a need for idealism, for morality, for purpose, which can get extremely zealous. And I mean, we recently, James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian and I, did some talks in Portland about how similar the intersectional, particularly, approach to SOCJUS is to religious narratives.
Yeah.
James Lindsay, he'd spent some years researching religious psychology and written a book about it.
He's a former guest of the podcast. We had him to talk about the what hoax they had published with Boghossian.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So this this really does seem to me like something that we have to resist. That what we've managed to achieve here in modernity with this Enlightenment ethos, with what Rausch calls liberal science, is unnatural to us almost. We really have to protect it with everything we've got because it works. You know, we are so much a majority intuitive creatures that we cannot trust that liberal secular democracy, that science are going to continue if we don't protect them. And I do see postmodernism as the latest onslaught against reason and against liberalism, as the earlier Counter-Enlightenment, and before there was even an Enlightenment, there was the mysticism of the 14th century. There was anti-national sort of parties throughout history. So I think that there are so many continuities that you can trace. And again, I'd say I don't think that very many Stop Just activists now are reading Hegel and Heidegger.
Yeah, that's for sure.
They're calling to some of the same intuitions.
Yeah. That's a very strong point. I don't know if you saw this paper, but it reminds me of this, and I've already mentioned it in a recent interview that I did on quite a different topic. But there was this recent paper in which they had compared the traits of social scientists and natural scientists, especially along the empathizing versus systematizing dichotomy. And they had found that people in the social sciences tend to score much higher in empathizing, whereas people in the natural sciences tend to score much higher in the systematizing. So it seems that this lends a lot of credence to your suggestion that there is indeed a deeper psychological sort of background to the phenomena which we are discussing, because these networks of ideas, of course, post-structuralism and everything that derived from it, certainly came from the social sciences, although one could say that at least some of the early post-structural theorists had, a decent formation, a decent, training, I should say, in epistemology for some of them. But, for the most, these things have clearly been, how should I put it? They have resonated with people with a training in the social sciences.
Yeah, you were breaking up a bit there, but I think I gist of what you were saying with the empathizing and systemizing, and this sort of tying in with psychology and intuitions. And I think it strongly does. The empathizing side will tie in very strongly with the care, harm, moral foundations identified by Haidt as particularly liberal. When those ones outweigh almost everything else, then that can lead to some quite extreme views. I'm not sure how systemizing is in on moral foundations, but
that's a tough question. I think it's not as clear these days. I think I heard Jordan Peterson once say that the preliminary results tend to think that people who are maybe high in systemizing, although I think he was talking about big five traits, so it's a bit different. But if I sort of go on go out on a limb and I say that systemizing is strongly correlated with big five traits, intellectual openness, and also conscientiousness. I think Peterson was saying that it seems as though people who have these, who score high on these big five traits might tend to lean, classical liberal libertarian, but it seems to be, it remains to be further explored.
I certainly don't think it simplistically suggests right-wing attitude, because we generally think that scientists, techies, and that sort of particularly systematic mind tend to be more left-wing. But I did somebody did also send me something saying that they're well overrepresented among libertarians as well. So yeah, I think we'll watch this space. Well, quite possibly other people have already got the answers to this, but I have to say I haven't looked into it.
Yes, a recent guest told me that. So yeah, he's the one with whom we also talked about these psychological traits and sort of academic specializations, and the initial motivation for him was to look at it has been noticed that people who are in Islamist groups in Muslim majority countries tend to feature, among them there are extremely many engineering graduates. So they wanted to understand that, and they noted that people with engineering degrees tend to have psychological traits that one might probably be able to correlate to right-wing political orientation, but he told me that it doesn't apply very much to people who are in the more fundamental, less applied sciences.
That's interesting, and I've certainly seen that. There's an awful lot of engineers in who have joined ISIS, and we recently published an article where a defence of postmodernism, which I disagree with, obviously, in which he said that there are very few postmodernists who have joined. And I see the truth in that, but I think that when you have this kind of mind that has to make things work, that is so systematic, yes, it can certainly apply itself to some awful premises and carry them through to their logical conclusions in those ways, and this is much less likely to happen to someone who doesn't really believe in objective truth or consistent morality. And I think we could put too much, a lot of people do put too much focus on this and suggest that being a scientist is likely to make you a terrorist, which is obviously completely insane.
Actually, he also told me, this former guest, that although engineers are very much overrepresented in right-wing and religious extremist groups, people who are in disciplines such as even more fundamental academic engineering already are much less overrepresented, and then if you go into physics and biology and chemistry, they are actually very much underrepresented. Whereas people in the humanities tend to be somewhat overrepresented within left-wing extremist groups. So if you want to argue that the engineering mind makes you a right-wing terrorist, that's a bit careless if you are doing this as if you're using this within a strategy to defend the humanities, because you might be arguing without knowing it that studying the humanities makes you, so to say, a left-wing terrorist. But these are, of course, very simplistic ways of, sort of passing the data, for sure.
Yes, there's some very interesting trends coming up, and I'll be fascinated to find out more about what they signify.